it was used and as a practice in Egypt. So we really just don't have any historical kind of evidence whatsoever to show that binding was used by the Romans. Everything seems to point to nails, and so we have no reason to question that nails were used when it came to Jesus' crucifixion. And in fact, this is the uniform testimony.
Actually, we do. I have a book here by John Rousseau and Rami Araf, a book entitled Jesus and His World, a cultural and an archaeological and cultural dictionary. And here it is asserted that, in fact, in crucifixions it were possible to also use binding instead of nailing. So nailing was not in every
I'm sorry, what references do they use in antiquity for that, rather than just making a statement?
Well, you can read the book yourself.
Well, no, this is this is an academic debate, not a lunchroom discussion. And
yes.
you can't just say, well, this author says this. You have to provide reasons for it. And I'm providing reasons. I'm citing you sources. Now, if you like, I'd be happy to change.
I'll give you his references. In his bibliography, he has named here a long list. And rather than delay everyone with that, I'll show you the list. And if you would like, you can make a copy, and I can...
Okay, where's the list of what?
Here is the bibliography, just dealing with the crucifixion.
Right, but you're responsible now to show me where it says that binding is used, not just the bibliography that I have to go through and read now.
No, I don't think this is necessary, because remember, you cited Martin Hengel,
right,
whose book I have and is sitting in my hotel room right now. Martin Hengel, you cited Martin Hengel. I did not question the integrity of the scholar. Martin Hengel is a known scholar. I respect him, and if he says that his sources lead him to this conclusion, I have no doubt in that. Here we have a couple of respectable scholars producing a respectable book with a long list just dealing with the few pages in which they have dealt with the crucifixion. So pages 74, 75, 76, 77, and a part of 78 deals with the crucifixion. Mm-hmm. And then his list of books almost fills the rest of that page. So I do not question the integrity of these scholars, and you cannot say that in the midst of a debate here, we should question the scholar who got the information from the other scholars. That would be, I think, a sticky point.
Okay, well, at least I got Josephus, I've got Tacitus. Who can you provide as a counterexample where binding was used by the Romans?
What I'm providing is a book that has been written by a couple of reputable scholars. They're not Muslim scholars. John Rousseau, Rami Araf. It's a book with a respectable presentation. It's a scholarly academic text. It's billed as a dictionary, and in fact, that's what it is. It's a listing alphabetically of information of a historical nature. They're not making things up, and they have listed their bibliography. If you doubt that, you want to take it up with these scholars, go right ahead. But you cannot here insist that that information is wrong without having proper proof yourself. You see, an expert witness by himself is a proof for a point. And if you want to refute that proof, you can bring other expert witnesses who say that it is not. So far, all you have mentioned is that Martin Hengel has found evidence that binding was used for crucifixions in another part of the world. But you're arguing from silence, because you have not a proof from Martin Hengel that binding was not used among the Romans. And here these scholars have offered information to show that binding was used. I don't think we have any reason to doubt the integrity of these scholars. Now, if I had said it from myself, then you can challenge me, okay, Shebir, bring me your proof. I brought you the proof here. Then you ask me for the proof for the proof.
What you have shown me is a single book, and you haven't given me a statement out of it which shows that the Romans used binding. Hengel in his book does provide 13 sources where the Romans used nails. Yes. And like I said, we can add Josephus to that. We can probably add Tacitus to it, because he says that Christians were affixed to crosses, the Latin term affixed, and then they were set ablaze on fire, and they wouldn't use binding or else the ropes would burn. So nails make more sense there. If we take Tacitus there, well, then that would be an additional source and bring it up to 15.
Yeah, but you see, notice that you're arguing from silence, because saying that nails were used does not deny that for some other victims, ropes were used.
Right,
and you said yourself.
If all the evidence we have says nails, and we do have the 4 testimonies of the Gospels, since you're using them, I'll just point out that John mentions nails. In fact, Luke alludes to it when he says that Jesus showed his hands to them. So if that's the case, we do have two reports that said nails. It seems to go in with the other reports that are available. And so,
but you're not answering to my point, Mike.
Well,
my point is that because it was known that nails were generally used, the gospel writers wrote that nails were used. Not because it was historically, factually witnessed and recorded at the time, but because at the time when the disciples were writing, they wrote what normally happened at a crucifixion. Not only what normally happened, but as time went by, and they wanted to prove definitely that Jesus underwent the worst possible tortures, they improved the level of torture. So it went from Mark a little to Matthew and Luke further, and John even worse. And in Mel Gibson's movie, even further still. So I'm mentioning Mel Gibson's movie not because we're debating that, but because it illustrates what happened with the Gospels, the kind of imaginative work that went in. And the fact that Gibson can do that with us today, even though we have the written Gospels before us to see where he has actually gone off on a tangent, shows the kinds of imaginative work that could have been done before him prior to the availability of these written documents. So the first writers had much more of a latitude to present the case the way they thought it should be presented. And in fact, combing through the Gospels, this is what we find that they did. So that whereas in Mark's Gospel, Pilate is doubtful that Jesus had died so soon, in Mark and Luke, even though they are basically almost verbatim giving us the same story from Mark, they have nevertheless reworded it so that the doubt of Pilate is not expressed in Matthew and Luke. And Raymond Brown says that possibly the reason why Matthew and Luke reworded it such is so that their readers should not also doubt, like Pilate, as to whether or not Jesus had actually died. And I think that reminds me of the Quranic point, that those who differed concerning him were in doubt as to what happened, as to the matter. They were not sure that they actually killed him, and for certainly they killed him not. Some other interpretation is necessary here. And in the light of, if no one had claimed that he had resurrected from the dead, perhaps we would accept that he actually died, just like the historians do. And that's what they say, because they do not believe that he actually physically, bodily resurrected from the dead. So they say he died. But if we are to say he resurrected from the dead, then we must question, did he really die or not? And when we look at the earliest strata of evidence, there is no clear indication that he actually died on the cross.
The Gospels say he died. All of them say he died. All of the Gospels say he rose from the dead. None of them say there was any doubt. So because I can't prove that nails were used, even though that's the testimony of the Gospels, because I can't prove that ropes weren't used instead, the Gospel writers are doubting whether Jesus died and rose?
No, Mike, the Gospel writers are not doubting that Jesus died and rose. I don't think you're getting my point. The Gospel writers are out to prove that Jesus died and rose. And the later the Gospel, the more they try to prove it. And you can see that after the first Gospel is written, some questions are raised. And the later Gospels try to eliminate those questions. For example, who carried the cross of Jesus? I mentioned in my opening presentation that some second century Christians believed that Simon the Cyrene, who was made to carry the cross of Jesus, was made to look like Jesus and crucified instead. Now, the Gospel according to John says that Jesus went out carrying his own cross. And then the next thing you know, he arrives at Golgotha. So you cannot have it both ways. The first three Gospels has it that Simon the Cyrene was compelled to carry the cross because obviously Jesus was too weak to carry it. The Gospel according to John shows that Jesus is strong and powerful throughout. He doesn't get arrested, he hands himself over. Nobody dares to arrest him because they just fall back to the moment he says, I am he. Jesus hands himself over because he's deliberately dying for the sins of mankind. A very different picture than we have in the Synoptic Gospels. Now, in the Gospel according to John, because Jesus is so strong throughout, he doesn't need anybody to carry his cross, but a more important point. People were reading the other Gospels and using it as a proof that possibly Simon was in fact crucified instead of Jesus. John did not want his Gospel to be read in this particular way, and so he has it that Jesus went out carrying his own cross. He emphasizes that point. Not just simply that Jesus went out carrying his cross, but Jesus went out carrying his own cross, as it says in the NIV. there is an emphasis there because John wants to make sure that everybody knows that there's no Simon of Cyrene here to deal with. It's just Jesus. He's strong throughout. He goes up to the cross by himself. Nobody arrests him. Nobody can take his life away from him. He gives it up of his own accord. He lays it down, and he has the authority and power to take it up again. A very different Jesus, a very different gospel, a very different story, and you can see the evolution. So what you have to deal with is that evolution, and you have to show that the evidence for the actual death and physical bodily resurrection of Jesus from the dead is there in the earliest strata. It is not enough to say, well, the later strata says this.
But that's not my argument. My argument has been, it's in the earliest strata. That's what I've been emphasizing.
No, but
yet you keep going to the Gospels. I'm saying, I'm over here on this hill.
No, but
I'm still waiting for you.
Mike, in fairness, I have actually addressed you over on that other side of the hill.
But all you're saying is the Gospels say this. It's kind of like your argument is, all right, the Gospels contain legend, therefore the sources that existed decades prior to the Gospel must be cut from the same cloth. And that doesn't necessarily follow.
No, what I've shown is an evolution. You see, the earliest stage in the belief in the resurrection of Jesus was that God somehow raised Jesus back to life, even though people had seen him dying. That God rescued Jesus and raised him to himself. That's the earliest strata.
No, it's not that he rescued him. I mean, there's nothing in the early strata that says rescue him. I mean, you presented the rescue theory, but there's no evidence for it. It's contrary to the eyewitness testimony. It's based on a single source written 600 years after Jesus with no contact with the eyewitness, and it's ad hoc. That is because it's a supernatural explanation with no evidence that's contrary to the evidence. It seems that it was constructed not so much in an attempt to rescue Jesus as it is to rescue Islam.
No, I'm not speaking of rescue here as rescue prior to death. What I'm saying is that the earliest belief in the resurrection of Jesus from the dead, as we can tell from the earliest sources, is that despite the fact that everyone had seen Jesus dying on the cross, God had somehow rescued Jesus and raised him to himself, so that Peter can proclaim in the Acts of the Apostles that death could not hold him. And of course, because God was with him, rescuing him, raising him from the dead. You can put it that way if you want. You mentioned the speech of Peter, which we are now referring to.
So you did say the earliest strata talks about Jesus being raised from the dead. Do you grant that?
The earliest strata, well, we should first listen to the words, and then we'll talk about the interpretation, because there's something to be said about that. The passage which Peter is citing in the Acts of the Apostles is from the Psalms, Psalm 16. Read the commentary on Psalm 16. The New Jerusalem Bible, in its footnoting on that psalm, says that this actually refers to a person who has had a close brush with death. The psalm does not actually necessitate the person physically dying. So now, to say that God raised this person from the dead does not necessarily, in the ancient world, require that the person had to be physically actually dead. You see, our conception of what involves death or what means death has changed over time. You mentioned previously N.T. Wright in his excellent book, This Thick, on the resurrection of the Son of God. If you read it throughout, you will see he mentions some of the conceptions that were there and some of which you refer to, but he also mentions the story Kalerho. In the story, Kalerho is beaten by her husband and she apparently dies. And she is buried, but some grave robbers come and they're surprised to find her alive. They're scared off, and Kalerho survives. And then, according to the story, as cited by N.T. Wright, she says, I was dead and I came back to life. Even though we know from the story that she was not dead. But this is how people might refer to things. If a guy is diagnosed with death today, he's kept in a morgue, he's watched for a little bit, and in fact he doesn't actually die, he might say, I came back from the dead, but we know he wasn't actually dead. Today our conception of death has actually improved because we would put a person through an EEG, through an ECG. There are certain grimacing effects that we test for, 5 of them, that are noted by Constance Jones in his book, The Complete Book of Death and Dying. And after all of these tests, we keep a person to just watch him just to make absolutely sure. So it is possible that a person might appear to be dead in the ancient world and that he wasn't actually dead. But if that person survived, one would say that he actually came back from the dead. Documentation for this is found in an excellent book by Jan Bondesen, His book is entitled Buried Alive. a terrifying history of our most primal fear. And what he has shown here is that throughout history, there have been difficulties identifying when exactly is a person finally dead. And he showed in particular in the time of Jesus, though Jesus was not his particular concern, he's just simply going through the whole sweep of history. What he has shown is that in that time, people could not determine when a person actually had died. And in that same book, we have a quotation, this other book here, we have a quotation from one of the Jewish Talmud sources, which might help us to understand why the women, disciples of Jesus, went to the tomb. Listen to it. It says, the Babylonian Talmud stipulates, one should go out to the cemetery and check on the dead 3 days after the funeral, and one should not fear that by doing so he follows a Gentile practice. It happened that a checkup after 3 days discovered that a certain person was buried alive. This person lived for another 25 years, had sons, and then died. And the reference is here. See, they've actually given the reference. So if you ask me now, it is there.
Okay.
So
Yeah, but the Talmud, can I respond to some of this? Because you're giving me a whole lot here.
Okay, we've shifted into the next quarter of the last quarter hour.
Okay.
We'll be going to you for some questions in about 12 minutes.
The Talmud is late. It's several hundred years after Jesus. So just because the Talmud mentions that in its day, when it was reporting this stuff, which could have been 300-400 years after Christ, that was the way things were done, that doesn't mean that that's the way it was done in Jesus' day. In fact, you mentioned about how we can't be certain a person's dead. Well, because we don't have EEGs, I really don't think that they would have had much doubt that John the Baptist was dead, who had been beheaded.
Yes.
So now, even with this thing, with the Talmud, they may have gone to the tomb to check it out to see if the person...
You see, Mike, that is exactly my point. You see, once a person is beheaded, you're sure he's dead. But you put a person on a cross, you expect that after 3